Awesome. Take another 30 seconds to get yourself set up. Again, please chat at 100 when your notes are ready. I apologize. I'm at the front desk. That's why you might be hearing the bells. Awesome. I have 2 100s, still waiting on a couple more. Again, please chat at 100 when you have your notes ready to go. Thank you, Skyanne. Thank you, Sierra. Thank you, Leah. Awesome. Let's go ahead and get started with the political developments of the 1960s. As always, this lecture is being recorded, so that way you have it to follow back on in case you are unable to catch all the notes. And remember, you can use your notes in today's exit ticket. As always, please chat me if you guys have any questions. So first, we're going to start the politics of the 1960s with the election of 1960. And this election was super important. It was between Democrat JFK, or John F. Kennedy is his full name. So again, it's between Democrat JFK and Republican Richard Nixon. So again, the election is between JFK, who is a Democrat, and Richard Nixon, who is a Republican. No, it's okay. So a little information on JFK. JFK had been in the House of Representatives and the Senate for 14 years. And while he had all this experience, many people were unsure about him as a candidate because he was very young. At 43, he was the youngest to ever successfully run for president. So again, at 43, he was the youngest man to ever run for president. People were also skeptical about him because he was Catholic instead of Protestant. And there had never been a Catholic president before. On the other side, you have Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon is a Republican, and he was President Eisenhower's vice president for 8 years. And Kennedy wins, ultimately, the presidency of 1960 with an insanely close election. And many people believe that the reason why JFK was able to win is because he took part in the first televised debates in history. So this was the first time Americans got to watch and actually see candidates actually run for president and campaign. And so ultimately, JFK wins the election of 1960. Next, we're going to look at Kennedy's domestic programs. Early in Kennedy's presidency, he says that America is on a new frontier. So again, one of JFK's key phrases is the new frontier. And this begins to refer to Kennedy's proposals for education, federal support of healthcare, urban renewal, and civil rights. Many of these things did have some success. Sorry, I see the chat. So again, the four things are aid for education, federal support of healthcare, urban renewal, and civil rights. You guys are gonna do great. The next thing that Kennedy wanted to propose was a man on the moon. And he believed that space exploration would help the economy. And this was done to help showcase American strength against the Soviets. So Kennedy proposes to put a man on the moon as a way to show American strength against the Soviets. And though he was not alive to see it, America did put the first man on the moon in 1969. JFK also put a lot of attention into his program on the Peace Corps. This is the Peace Corps is a group that he founds. And the goal of the Peace Corps is to organize American volunteers and give support to developing countries. One of the things that marks JFK's presidency is also the Warren Court. During the Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson years, the Supreme Court had a ton of really important Supreme Court verdicts under Chief Justice Earl Warren. So that's why it's called the Warren Court, is because it's held under the Chief Justice Earl Warren. And you're going to learn even more about these court cases next year in AP Government. This court put a lot of emphasis on criminal justice. So specifically, how to protect people who are arrested. Make sure I have this correct. The first Supreme Court case that builds on criminal justice is Mapp versus Ohio. Mapp is spelled M-A-P-P. Mapp versus Ohio in 1961 ruled that illegally seized evidence cannot be used in court. So again, it rules that illegally seized evidence cannot be used in court. The second Supreme Court case is Gideon versus Wainwright of 1963. And Gideon versus Wainwright declares that the state courts must provide an attorney for poor defendants. So again, Gideon versus Wainwright, you can see the spelling on the plaque on the screen, requires that the state courts provide an attorney for poor defendants. The next court case is Miranda versus Arizona. Miranda versus Arizona in 1966 requires police to inform the accused or arrested person of their rights. So whenever you guys watch a show like Law and Order or something like that, they are read their Miranda rights. That's what this name comes from. So Miranda versus Arizona in 1966 requires the police to inform the accused or arrested persons of their rights. Oops. The Warren Court also protects radical and revolutionary speech. So this is the freedom of expression or privacy. The Warren Court put a lot of effort into making sure that they protected all individuals' rights to speech. But probably the most important Supreme Court case that comes out of the Warren Court is Brown versus Board of Education. And as we know from our lecture on Tuesday, Brown versus Board of Education desegregates public education. Next, we're going to look at Kennedy's foreign policy. I'll give you 30 seconds to get your slide set up. So looking at Kennedy's foreign policy, as we know, Kennedy is serving as president right in the middle of the Cold War. So one of his biggest struggles is in the country of Cuba. As we know, that is just about 90 miles from the coast of Florida. The most controversial or the worst looking of Kennedy's foreign policy mistakes is the Bay of Pigs. In 1961, so again, this is the Bay of Pigs, President Kennedy approved an invasion on Cuba in an effort to remove Fidel Castro from power. But it turned out to be both a military and diplomatic disaster. Again, the Bay of Pigs was an invasion to remove Fidel Castro from power, who was the Cuban dictator. Another diplomatic controversy that Kennedy was involved in was the Berlin Wall, or the efforts in Berlin. In August of 1961, the Soviet Union demands that the United States pull all military from Berlin. So again, August of 1961, the Soviets declare that the United States has to remove all troops from Berlin. Kennedy refuses. And so in response, the Soviets built a wall around West Berlin to keep East Berlin citizens from escaping. So again, this is the Berlin Wall. The Soviets build a wall between West and East Berlin to prevent East Berlin people from escaping. There is one significant success in Kennedy's foreign policy, which is the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1962, the Americans discover that the Soviets are building missiles in Cuba. So again, in 1962, America discovers that the Soviets are building missile bases in Cuba. And America's response to this is what we know as the Cuban Missile Crisis. After consulting with his advisors, President Kennedy decides to have a naval blockade around Cuba. So again, a naval blockade around Cuba. What the United States was aware of is if they could not intimidate the Soviets enough, this could potentially lead to an all-out nuclear war. And so in response, the Soviet Union decides to pull their missiles from Cuba. So the Soviets decide to pull their missiles from Cuba and decide to remove some of the nuclear missiles from Turkey. So again, the Soviets remove missiles from Cuba and the United States remove missiles from Turkey. Following up from this, the United States also decides to create a better line of communication with the Soviets. And Kennedy establishes a hotline with the Soviet Union to emphasize communication in order to avoid potential nuclear war. And that is about all we have to discuss with the Kennedy's administration. And we're now going to transition to looking at the presidency of Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson became the president unexpectedly after Kennedy was assassinated in November of 1963. So again, Lyndon Johnson becomes president after Kennedy is assassinated in 1963, November. But Lyndon Johnson was a very well-known politician. And Johnson's big proposal as president was the Great Society. So again, Johnson's big proposal is the Great Society. This is his program where Johnson would work to end sorry, just one moment. Sorry, just looking at my script. So the Great Society is an over-encompassing term that refers to Johnson's programs on poverty aid, education, healthcare, economic development, and conservation. So again, the Great Society includes Johnson's programs on poverty aid, education, healthcare, economic development, and conservation. But probably the most important thing that Johnson focused on was his war on poverty. In 1964, Johnson declares the war on poverty in his policies. And he decided to create the OEO, the Office of Economic Opportunity. The OEO included a Head Start program for preschoolers and the Job Corps for vocational training. Vocational training is learning how to be like a plumber, a mechanic, things like that. However, all of the work that Lyndon Johnson does in the Great Society and War on Poverty, unfortunately, the funding for those is cut once the Vietnam War starts. Because of the Great Society and the great change that it did bring to the United States, Lyndon Johnson did win a landslide victory in 1964. And in 1964, not only does Johnson win the presidency, he also gets Democratic majorities in both houses of Congress. So again, Johnson wins the presidency in 1964, and the Democrats get the majority in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. Now we're going to take a zoom in into this Great Society programs and what the Great Society really did. Probably some of the most well-known programs from the Great Society are Medicare and Medicaid, which are still around today. Medicare provides low-cost medical insurance to Americans over the age of 65. And Medicaid provides similar services, but to those who are low income. So again, Medicare is low-cost medical insurance to Americans over 65. Medicaid is similar services, but to people with low income. Alongside the increase of Medicare and Medicaid, the United States also starts to create more subsidies or opportunities for those that are low income. This includes better funding for public transit, an increase on public housing, and a new focus on crime prevention. Johnson also develops the Department of Transportation and the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So again, Congress is increasing funding for public transit, public housing, and crime prevention. And Johnson also creates the Department of Transportation and the Department of Housing and Urban Development. While you guys finish those notes, I am going to transition somewhere a little quieter. because of all of these programs, many call the Great Society the 1960s version of the New Deal. So again, many call this the 1960s version of the New Deal, and it faces some of the same criticisms of being too expensive and of not doing enough. Now we're going to transition and look at Johnson's foreign policy, which is honestly most defined by him in Vietnam. And it's important to note, as I stated earlier, the Great Society is very limited because they are working under the circumstances of Vietnam. So a little bit of background information. Under JFK, the United States had supported South Vietnam. So again, the United States supported South Vietnam as they were facing more and more conflict with North Vietnam. South Vietnam is usually considered the democratic portion of Vietnam, whereas North Vietnam is considered the more communist piece. Which brings us to 1964 and the Gulf of Tonkin. In August of 1964, Johnson uses a naval incident in the Gulf of Tonkin to build up US relations in Vietnam. And ultimately, Congress approves of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. So again, in 1964, Johnson uses a naval incident in the Gulf of Tonkin to escalate the United States involvement with Vietnam. And we have about 10 minutes left and 3 more slides after this, so I'm going to have to stop repeating. So make sure you guys are following along and getting the key points that I say, and the video will be available if you need to fill in anything. This leads us to the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Now, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, Gulf of Tonkin resolution, was signed by Congress in 1964. And the Gulf of Tonkin resolution gives the president basically a blank check to do whatever he deems necessary in Vietnam. So again, Congress is telling the president that he can do whatever he wants in regards to the United States in Vietnam. And this changes the balance of power in Congress and gives the president way more power than he ever has had before. This also leads to a lot of criticism of Vietnam, as many claim it to be an illegal war that did not follow the Constitution. After Johnson wins re-election in 1964, he begins to escalate tension in Vietnam. So again, after President Johnson is reelected, escalation in Vietnam continues. He increases the amount of soldiers in Vietnam by 500,000. So for example, as you see in the chart, in 1964, there is about 25,000 troops, and by 1967, over 500,000. And the declared goal of this escalation is to make sure that South Vietnam has a stable government. This was largely unsuccessful. And most of the war between Vietnam and the United States is basically a stalemate. Nothing really changes, despite massive losses of life on both sides. Things are at its darkest for the United States in Vietnam during the Tet Offensive. On January 30th, 1968, North Vietnam launches a major offense against the United States in South Vietnam. Now, after the Tet Offensive, the United States realizes that this war is going to be much harder to win than they thought. And many consider this to be a major victory for North Vietnam psychologically. So even though militarily it wasn't as big of a victory as you would expect, psychologically, this is considered like the beginning of the end of the war. In fact, in 1968, Johnson made a televised appearance, and he says that the United States would begin limiting bombing in North Vietnam and begin negotiating peace. So despite the success of the Great Society, ultimately the controversy surrounding Vietnam becomes a really bad look for the Johnson administration. And now we're going to zero in on the last two slides on 1968. Because of all of the controversy surrounding Vietnam, Johnson decides he's not going to run for re-election in 1968. However, there was no clear successor to Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson's vice president, Hubert Humphrey, was the clear nominee, but a lot of Democrats did not think that way. And the Democratic National Convention has all American eyes on it. During this convention, police attack anti-war protesters in front of television cameras. Which makes the Democrats look very incompetent and very divided. Which brings us to the election of 1968. The Democratic Party was divided. It was divided basically into two groups. Southern white supremacists, who were used to being Democrats from the Civil War times, and on the other side, you have this new era of progressivism that was launched by JFK and Lyndon Johnson, started by FDR. When George Wallace, governor of Alabama, was not picked as the Democratic nominee, he decides to run as a third-party candidate in the election of 1968. Appealing to that Southern white supremacist voting group. On the other side, Richard Nixon goes for it again and decides to run for president. Nixon runs as a Republican again, and he runs as the law and order candidate, determined to end the war with Vietnam, end the controversy in the United States domestically, and bring a return to that law and order feeling of the 1950s. And while Nixon won a narrow majority for the popular vote, he absolutely took the majority of the Electoral College. And the end of the 1960s is a shift from the progressive policies of the late 50s and early 60s to the more conservative politics of the 70s and 80s. And that is the lecture for today. If you want to go ahead and transition to pulling up your exit ticket. As a reminder, you do not need to upload photos of your notes. I hope that and trust that you take them. Once you submit your exit ticket and click turn in on Google Classroom, you will be free to go. Please reach out if you have any questions or need me to clarify anything from the lecture. And we'll be good to go. So again, make sure you are doing the multiple choice and answering the open response question at the end. Again, while you're taking your exit ticket, if you have any questions for me from the lecture, feel free to send them.